Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's webinar on the challenge of natural hazards, focusing really particularly tonight on tectonic processes and tectonic hazards with Iceland as our case study. My name's Karen. I work for Discover the World Education, having previously taught geography for over 20 years. I also have my colleague Kat with me. She's monitoring the chat box, so please do ask any questions that you may have, and she'll relay them over to me. And always, as always, please can you keep the chat relevant to the webinar and to the topic that we're discussing at this particular time. So I'm going to turn my video off just so that you can actually see the actual screen and all the images that are there. But as I said, any questions that you've got, please do let us know and we can answer those as we go through. Okay, so over the next hour or so, we're going to be looking at tectonic processes, why they are natural hazards, what are the factors affecting the risk of these hazards, the plate tectonic theory, and also the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes. We're then going to look at Iceland as a case study to see how tectonic processes affect the Icelandic population and what they're doing to manage the risks. We're also going to consider the reasons why people continue to live in Iceland, and not just live, but actually thrive, both socially and emotionally, as well as economically. And as always, like all of our webinars, I'm going to give you plenty of opportunities for you to really think and write like geographers. So really sort of like point out some of those key things. Your teachers always say to you, let's write like a geographer, let's really think like a geographer. So we're going to look at some of those opportunities as well. So what are natural hazards? They are extreme natural events that can cause a loss of life. They can cause extreme damage to property and disrupt human activities. For example, earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes. And there's some images here just to sort of like get you in the right frame of mind. There's two categories with natural hazards. We have tectonic hazards, like the ones that we see here. And then we also have the climatic hazards, flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, and also droughts. We need to consider the factors which affect risk. Some of our developments in farming in order to produce food for our ever-increasing population, and perhaps the most topical factor of climate change and the increase in extreme weather events. I'm sure that you saw some of the news reports over the last year or so, actually, on extreme weather events, the droughts and the heat wave that was happening in Siberia, as well as the forest fires that happened just this time last year, actually, down in Australia. Seems a long time ago that these forest fires were happening, but it was a year ago in Australia. And these extreme weather events are really sort of like affecting our population, and they are risk things that are actually going to affect the people. You can see here, the people in Bangladesh actually really struggling from the flooding there. Okay, so human activities really do affect the risk. They can influence how often certain natural hazards occur and how severe they are. And in order to sort of like understand where and why these natural hazards may happen, we can then minimize the impact it may have on people. Management and preparation can help reduce the risk. Okay, and that's really important. So looking at when, where, why, and how natural hazards occur means that we can actually look at minimizing their impact. We can't generally minimize the actual hazard itself, but we can minimize the impact on our lives. So if we look at some key things here, and these are your key words in terms of thinking and writing like a geographer, so really get to know what these mean. Urbanisation, you know, the growth of cities, built up areas, the movement of people from rural to urban areas. You know, whether a place is densely populated or whether it is sparsely populated. You know, even if we just look at these two images that are on the screen here, obviously the top image is an earthquake in quite a densely populated area. So therefore the risk is high. Whereas the volcano in the bottom image is obviously occurring in an area that's quite sparsely populated. So whilst the hazard is there, you know, the actual risk on the people, the impact on the people is very different. And then we can look at the level of economic development. So whether the country has, you know, a high income or a low income, whether it is a poverty stricken country or area as well. And even if you look at somewhere like Italy, and you've got, you know, Naples, which sits in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, you know, there's some very poverty stricken areas, some very densely populated areas. You know, 22 million people live in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. That's quite a frightening thought, I think. So from a country that is actually a high income country, you know, it's very densely populated and there's quite a lot of poverty in that particular city. And it's important to look at that, really important. And obviously low income countries who will not have the infrastructure, not have the emergency services, not have, you know, the policies, the preparation, the planning that's in place. And that's a real issue. So all of these things, you know, we need to take into account. When you're thinking like a geographer, we really want you to look at lots of different aspects. We want you to look at the social side, the economic side, you know, the environmental side, the political side, as well as looking at the physical aspects, which is obviously the tectonic hazard itself. We want you to look at what you can't always see. Use what we do know and understand, and actually make some educated assumptions using your knowledge and then pulling it together. Okay, so let's now just turn our complete attention and focus to earthquakes and volcanoes. It's really important to have an understanding of what these words actually mean. You can then use them quite effectively in your writing. So an earthquake, for example, a sudden violent period of ground shaking, okay? And then you've got some other keywords here, things like friction, pressure, the stresses which build up to breaking point, and it's that sudden release that causes the earthquake. And then always have an example. For example, you know, the San Andreas Fault on the west coast of the USA. And then volcanoes. A volcano is a large, often cone-shaped landform formed over long periods of several eruptions. Again, have some examples for, you know, the belts that are along the Pacific Ring of Fire, or the volcanoes that are on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and we're going to look at one of those volcanoes later on today. And then some, as we know, they occur at hotspots. So, for example, where Hawaii is, you know, it's not on a plate boundary, but it is on a hotspot, and that gives itself to having a very sort of active volcanic system. As I'm saying, use those keywords and really, really know what they mean. So let's look at plate tectonics theory as a bit of a revision for you. Some keywords on the screen here, and I'm going to use those as we talk about plate tectonics theory here. So the crust is what you and I live on. It's by far the thinnest of the layers of Earth. The thickness really depends on where you are on Earth. The oceanic crust is around 5 to 10 kilometres in depth, whereas the continental mountain ranges can be up to 30 to 45 kilometres thick. The thin oceanic crust is denser than the thicker continental crust, so it therefore floats slightly lower in the mantle. And you'll find some of the thinnest oceanic crust along the mid-ocean ridges where new crust is actively being formed. In comparison, where two continents collide, as in the case of the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, you get some of the thickest sections of crust because it crumples together. In very broad terms, oceanic crust is made up of basalt and continental crust is made up of rocks similar to granite. And then below the crust, you've got this solid, relatively cooler portion of the upper mantle that's combined with the crust to make the lithosphere layer. It's physically distinct from the below-lying layers because it's slightly cooler in temperature. And this layer usually goes around, or in depth is about 70 to 100 kilometres thick. Then below the lithosphere, you've got the asthenosphere layer. This is much hotter, it's malleable, and it extends about 700 kilometres into the Earth. So this is really quite a large area. And this layer acts as the lubricating layer that allows that crust to move over the Earth's surface. And this is the mantle. It makes up around about 84% of the Earth. And then right in the centre, you've got the core, which, geologists believe that the outer core is around about 80% iron with some nickel. It's hot enough to be melted, but not quite enough pressure to make it solid. So you've got a real sort of disparity between there, and the inner core is very density driven, and the pressures there are so high that despite the very, very high temperatures, the inner core is actually solid. And it's also got quite heavy elements there. So you've got gold, silver, platinum, different minerals and elements like that. They think that the temperatures in the sort of like the core reach up to about 5,400 degrees centigrade. And so it's about the same temperature as the surface of the sun. So yeah, really quite hot. And there's still a lot of research being done on here. Obviously, geologists and scientists are still understanding what's going on there. Okay, so let's look at the plates itself, because this is what actually causes our earthquakes and volcanoes. So the plates move because they're carried along by convection currents in the upper mantle of our Earth. The mantle is, we know, a slowly flowing layer of rock just beneath the Earth's crust. Now, the hot rock just below the surface rises because it's hot. And then when it cools again, it gets slightly heavy, and so it starts to sink. So in this way, our converging plates push into each other and the diverging plates move away. So they've got this circular movement that is moving the plates on top of the surface. And this is why we get some mountains when you've got plates moving towards each other. We've got an imbalance in the magma where plates are being broken down when they're having to sort of like subduct into the mantle, and that's what causes the volcanoes. And then sometimes when the plates get stuck, or they're sliding past each other and causing some friction, that's when we get our earthquakes. We can look at this convection currents in a slightly different way. It's not just in the mantle, it's actually, you can get them in water. And you can do this. You can have a saucepan of peas, put the peas in your cold water, start to heat them up, and you will actually see the peas start to go round in a sort of like a circular motion. So the hot water is rising and then it falls. It gets heated again, so it rises to the surface and then falls. So it's exactly the same. It's quite a simple process that's going on in the mantle. So we know by plate tectonics theory that the Earth's crust is split up into 7 major and several minor tectonic plates. And as you can see, the edges of these plates are very similar to the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes. So you can see here the plate boundaries, and you can see it's a very similar pattern that links the earthquakes and the volcanoes, okay? And these sort of like links between the two form the evidence to plate tectonic theory. And then in terms of some key words and terminology that you need to know here, you need to know what distribution means, where they are. You need to know the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is here on the edge of the Pacific plate. And you can see that's where we have lots and lots of volcanoes and earthquakes. So that's the Pacific Ring of Fire. We then have clusters, because you'll see that the volcanoes and earthquakes tend to be in bands, in ribbons, in clusters along the edge of the plate. So use the word clusters because they are in clusters. And then we have hotspot. So say, for example, we have Hawaii on the central part of the Pacific Ocean here. It's not on a plate boundary, but it is a hotspot. So where the surface is slightly thinner and there's a magma chamber underneath. Iceland here, that is also a hotspot. But in addition to being a hotspot area, it's also on a divergent, and we'll look at that in a minute, a divergent plate margin as well. So it's kind of got a bit of a double whammy going on here. We also need to use the word belts because you'll notice that the earthquakes and volcanoes, they're in belts along here. And then the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is quite an important part of the central band here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where you've got the two plates moving apart. Okay, so these are some of the terminologies that you need to know, some of the words that you should be using when you answer your questions, and words that you should be using when you're in the classroom actually. So talk like a geographer and actually use these keywords when you're talking, because then you'll automatically put them in your writing and that will give you higher marks. Okay, some examples. Hawaii and Iceland, I've talked about those. Hawaii and Iceland. I know we're focusing very much on Iceland today, this afternoon or this evening, but a good example is Hawaii as well, because it doesn't form the normal sort of distribution as to where earthquakes and volcanoes are. So let's look at why volcanoes and earthquakes are generally found on the plate boundaries. We know that the crust is split up into several plates, and these move, we know now, into different directions. And there's three main ways. There's convergent or destructive, where the plates are moving together. There's divergent or constructive, where the plates are moving apart. And then you've got transform or conservative, where the plates are sliding past each other. We also have the collision plate boundary, and sort of continental rift zone. But today we're mainly going to look at the three types of convergent, transform, and divergent. Okay. So let's first of all look at convergent or destructive, and this is where two plates move towards each other. These can either be an oceanic plate with a continental plate or two continental plates. Now, when you've got an oceanic plate and a continental plate moving together, the heavier, denser oceanic plate will be forced underneath the continental plate, okay, and it will be subducted. This is your subduction zone, okay. You can see here your subduction zone is here. You can see the oceanic plate is being dragged down into the mantle, which is going to cause an imbalance here and a breaking up of the plate, which could cause pressure and release that pressure through a volcano. You've also got this area here where there could be friction and where pressure could be built up. And when that is released, that's when you're going to get the earthquake. You quite often get mountain ranges here as the continental plate is crumpled. But as you can see, you have to have one plate moving this way, one plate moving this way, and you have to have the oceanic plate because it's denser and heavier. That's being subducted. And then you have this plate here crumpling up. This is the continental plate. So on a destructive or a convergent plate margin, you are going to get volcanoes and earthquakes. And a good example of this is the Andes Mountains, actually. So the Andes Mountains will be here, and you will have the Peruvian Trench, which is your subduction zone, going on here. So that's a really, really good example. When you get two continental plates moving towards each other, there isn't any subduction because you haven't got that heavier, denser plate being dragged down. So what happens is the crust crumples and you get these very, very large fold mountains. For example, the Himalayas are formed when two continental plates are sort of like moving together, and you very often get quite powerful earthquakes, like the earthquake that we had in Nepal not too long ago, actually. And so that's what can happen there. Remember some of these words that we're talking about: subduction, continental plate, friction, you know, all of those things, very, very important that you should be using. Okay, so let's look at constructive or a divergent plate margin. This is when two plates are moving apart. And this is the plate margin that has actually caused the mid-Atlantic ridge. And Iceland is the only place on the mid-Atlantic ridge where the land rises above the ocean. Now, constructive plate margins generally cause mild earthquakes. And then as the plates are moving apart, magma fills the gap and it rises through fissures, which eventually become volcanoes. Now, generally, because the magma under this particular plate margin is quite hot and fluid, the volcanoes on these plate margins are quite broad and flat. They're rather like, you know, they're the shield volcanoes. It's not often that you get the composite cone volcano on plate margins like this. Okay, so that is a divergent or a constructive plate margin. And then we have the transform or the conservative plate boundary, where two plates are sliding past each other, rather like the boundary actually on the San Andreas fault. There generally aren't any earthquakes volcanoes created here, sorry, no volcanoes created here, but there are often very, very powerful earthquakes which are triggered because when the plates get stuck, and then all of a sudden the plates are released, it can cause quite a lot of movement. And the San Francisco earthquake, you know, that would be a fantastic example that you could use here. It's an old one. They are overdue for another one. But you know, the San Francisco, and then central sort of like Europe and Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, those sort of areas, they sit on transform or conservative plate boundaries. So they would be really, really good examples for you to use there. Okay, so let's look at Iceland and the mid-Atlantic ridge. It's one of the only, as we know, Iceland is one of the only places on the mid-Atlantic ridge which is above the ocean. Now, the mid-Atlantic ridge is the longest sub-ocean mountain range. It's a constructive plate boundary in its very simplest form. And here we have got the Eurasian plate moving away from the North American plate at around 2 to 4 centimetres every year. It's a constructive or a divergent plate boundary. There are plenty of ridges, mountains, and actually a string, you can see here, you know, a belt of volcanoes. This is the mid-Atlantic ridge right in the middle of Iceland. You've got this ridge of volcanoes and fissures and sort of like quite large cracks in the surface as this, you know, plates are moving apart. There are over 200 volcanoes in Iceland. 33 of them are active. And this is one of the fissures actually that we can see here. And it's also in the unique situation of having here a hotspot underneath it. So it's actually got a large magma chamber as well as having the two plates moving apart. So it is quite a fantastic place to study volcanoes. Now, there's much academic evidence to support the fact that if you have some generic background knowledge of a country in terms of its physical and social uniqueness, you'll actually be able to understand and reinforce more fully the different case studies that you study in a classroom. So I think, and I'm encouraging you now, that when you do get a case study, just do a little bit of background information into the country, because it will really give you an understanding of how the people are. You know, what is the country like? What's their political, what's their social, what's their environmental background? Are they going to work with nature, or are they going to try and, you know, go against it? So I want just very quickly for us to have a little bit of a background to Iceland, the land of fire and ice, before we look actually at the infamous Eyjafjallajokull volcanic eruption of 2010. And also we're going to look at how this small country is actually leading the world. So coming from a country of 340,000 people, how it's leading the world in planning and preparing for the next natural hazard, and how they're really thriving in this hazardous location. So Iceland is a small country in the central part of the North Atlantic Ocean. It sits at 66 degrees north. It's around about 44 kilometres at its northern tip from the Arctic Circle. Its capital is Reykjavik, the most northern capital in the world, and it's ranked as one of the top happiest countries in the world. And in terms of crime, it's the safest country in the world. It doesn't have much crime at all. They're incredibly green. They're striving towards being carbon neutral in 2030, and all of their power comes from renewable sources, either geothermal or hydroelectric. The Icelandic people are a very incredibly tolerant and accepting nation. They're complete egalitarian society, fabulous equal rights for all, and very forward thinking and optimistic. And I've sort of said here, you know, it's got the oldest parliament and democracy in the world. So you would kind of think that they have a real community type environment. And then if we look at the people, it has a population of around about 350,000, and that, you know, 78% of those live within this southwest corner. They have a female prime minister at the moment, Katrín Jakobsdóttir. Their president is called Gudni, who's voted for by the people for being a nice chap, and very, very sparsely populated. You can see from this map here that the majority of the people live here, but as you can see, there are some areas where there are hardly anybody living at all. So therefore, in terms of risk management, that is something that you may wish to consider. And in terms of the way they are as a nation, they have a very popular saying called "Theta Radast," and I use this quite a lot, particularly at the moment, it has to be said. It's a very popular saying, and it explains their very optimistic nature and how they work with the challenges of the environment to not just survive and exist along some very extreme conditions, because not only do they have obviously tectonic hazards, they're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, pretty close to the Arctic Circle, and so they do have some quite extreme weather as well. So they do have that, but they actually do thrive. As I said, top 3 happiest places to live, and that's been the last 10 years. Top 6 ranking in the Human Development Index, and the top 10 life expectancy. And they're saying Theta Radast basically means it will all work out one way or another. And I'm sure you've read what I've put here as to what they say, that, you know, they've learned to exist under extreme conditions and harness the natural resources that they create for its own prosperity, actually. Okay, so as I said, Iceland has around 33 active volcanoes. About a third of these are active volcanic systems under the glacial ice, hence the nickname, the land of fire and ice. The combination of ice and volcanic activity produces quite distinct hazards, such as Jökulárnar, which are high magnitude glacier floods. And with, you know, climate change and increased volcanic activity, the risk in Iceland of Jökulárnar is actually very high and is considered a greater risk than the actual volcano itself. And if you want to do some extended reading on this, Professor Fiona Tweed, in her article in the GA just in 2019, the autumn edition of the GA magazine, she actually wrote an amazing article based on this, on the Jökulhlaup threat to the Icelandic population. Okay, so let's take a look at Eyjafjallajokull, the infamous volcano that erupted in 2010. It not just caused impacts and responses within Iceland, but it really affected and impacted the rest of the world. And I would really encourage you as we go through this to just keep thinking like a geographer, and using some of these keywords to really help you. We're going to look at some of the primary and secondary effects, and also some of the immediate and long-term responses as well. So the economic cost of the eruption, I'm not going to read all these out, but obviously this is to do with a loss of money and the impacts on the economy. And the one that I really sort of like looked at when I was doing this was the fact that because of the lack of flights, there was quite a huge increase in the number of passengers using different forms of transport. So it may have got them to think about, do we need to take flights all the time? Maybe we can take another way. And also another one, which is slightly quirky, and it shows the sort of butterfly impact of this. Nissan, which is a Japanese car manufacturer in the UK, they actually halted production for several models one day because it wasn't able to import the parts from Ireland. So this volcano that happened in Iceland actually had an impact on producing cars in the UK because they couldn't get the parts from Ireland. The environmental impact, I think the one that I really sort of like struck a chord with me was the grounding of flights, actually, and it was something like 5 days that flights were grounded for. And I mean, I live in Lingfield, which is very close to Gatwick, and we're certainly noticing the lack of planes at the moment, and that would have been exactly the same case in 2010 as well. So that's quite a big environmental impact. And then if we look at the social impact on the people in Iceland, and there's some pictures here of, a little girl actually sort of rescuing some of the lambs from the farm to try and get them out of the ash. And farmers near the volcano, they were warned to keep their livestock inside. One, because obviously we didn't want the ash affecting the actual animals, but also because of the water sources were now contaminated with ash and with sulphur, which obviously can be quite deadly to the livestock if they did actually drink that. And, it was quite a small eruption, actually, but it really had quite a significant local and global impact. I'm going to look very quickly today at aviation, so looking at the airline industry and how that was impacted, the Icelandic economy, the farming, and then actually looking at what they're doing for the future. So, this particular point looks at the impact of this volcano on the Kenyan horticulture. And you will think, gosh, how can a small volcano in Iceland have an impact on the Kenyan economy? Well, it did. They lost $3 million a day whilst the airspace was closed because they couldn't get the flowers to the UK. And all of these flowers were actually left to rot. And it really did impact the horticultural industry in Kenya. And then we know that the Civil Aviation Authority was really criticised because they did ground flights completely. At the time, there was a real zero tolerance on flying aeroplanes in areas where there was ash. There had been an air crash some years previously in Indonesia because ash had got into the engines. However, they've looked at that, and the subsequent research means that there has actually been changes in what is happening in the future. So this one event in 2010 had quite significant sort of impacts on what happens now in the future. There's now much more flexibility, and it doesn't just depend on the level of ash, but how high that ash is, what's the density of that ash, you know, what aeroplane it is, because different aeroplanes now have different sort of tolerances to the amount of ash that's in there. So this you know, small volcanic event has significant impacts across the whole world. And if you look here, they've now set up, this was something that was set up after the Eyjafjallajokull eruption. They've now got the volcanic ash advisory centres, and you can see they're all over the world. And these provide information to allow flights to reroute around any area of contamination. So they will look at the weather forecast, they will look at where the wind is blowing, they will look at the density of the ash, how high it is in the atmosphere, and look at that as well. And these global networks, they actually do carry out the very, very vital monitoring, and they monitor the volcanoes, and they really do help with, you know, the air traffic superhighways, I'm going to say. You can see that the London VAAC, that actually covers the Icelandic volcanoes. Here are the global sort of superhighways in terms of air traffic, really. You can see these are the global flight routes, and these areas here in red, you can see that is the Pacific Ring of Fire, okay? And then you can see over here that we have sort of like the Icelandic areas here, and you can see where there's quite a lot of airline traffic, and obviously they're monitoring these areas quite significantly to keep everybody safe and continue to be effective. Now, the eruption really did firmly put Iceland on the map, because, you know, the foreign news media, because all the aeroplanes were sort of stopped and people were stranded all around the world. They descended on this island and they captured its spectacular landscapes for the world to see. Journalists struggled to pronounce the volcano's name. European airspace was completely closed, and it really put Iceland into people's geographical imaginations as a country actually to visit, and tourist numbers really, you know, rose after this particular event. There was a social media campaign called Inspired by Iceland, which was by the Icelandic Tourist Board, who sort of like had the tagline, you know, Iceland has never been more awake, yeah, because their volcanoes are erupting, and there's never been more an exciting time to visit the country, you know. And as a geography geek, yes, I would love to see a volcano erupt, I really, really would. And they really springboarded from that, and asked people to share their stories, share their memories of Iceland. You know, they used this social media platform and they turned this quite negative natural event into something that was very positive, changing the focus of the international attention on Iceland to showcase the island's, you know, quite unique and appealing attributes. The internet, you know, really increases the popularity of the place. You know, it's a feedback loop. Social media posts, more people want to go, even more posts. And this particular social media campaign was quirky, it was Icelandic, and quite enjoyable to watch. And the video here is actually, you know, it will make you smile, and it will show you some of the landscapes and the cultural side of Iceland as well. So I do recommend that you take a look at that. It then became sort of quite significant in terms of film companies and music artists. Those of you that have seen Game of Thrones, you'll recognise this one here. This is Arrowhead Mountain. It's not, it's Kirkjufell in Iceland. But, you know, obviously people wanted to go and see some of the scenery that they had seen there, and Passengers was filmed there. Many of the James Bond films have been filmed there. And then, of course, we have the Justin Bieber effect, and we do actually call it in Iceland the Justin Bieber effect. His hit song, I'll Show You, actually showcased Iceland fantastically, and that has really generated even more tourists to go to Iceland. You can see here some of the things that I've captured from social media over the last sort of like 6 or 7 years. You know, quite big celebrities going over there. Okay, so this graph, it clearly shows the increase of passengers after the 2010 eruption. So I've had a question, how do you pronounce that? Eyjafjallajokull. Okay, it's quite difficult. In the office, many of my colleagues call it E15. So it's Eyjafjallajokull. Okay, so you can see here 2010 was when the eruption was, and tourist numbers prior to then were pretty steady. And then they really started to increase. You will notice, though, the impact of the volcano, this is in 2018, was obviously lessened here as tourist numbers have started to plateau. Obviously, in 2020, the numbers have come significantly down. But what the Icelandic authorities are saying is that, you know, the tourism numbers were really sparked by this particular eruption. And then they're expecting it to sort of come to around about here, moving forwards. Okay. So just sort of like some of the lessons that were learnt by the eruption. It was basically a good sort of like trial, really, for when a big eruption like KATLA, which is overdue, was to erupt. It showed that they needed to have a more collaborative emergency response for the whole world. And we will see from those VAACs, you know, it's now a worldwide sort of like response, not just an Icelandic or a British sort of like, or a, you know, Japanese thing. It is literally everybody should get involved. They've adapted some policies within the airlines to make it much safer to use intelligent data, not just looking at something that happened many years ago. You know, how social media can turn something quite negative into something positive, which helped with the economy, and really has really springboarded their economy. And I do believe, and scientists do believe, that actually we know that Iceland has got volcanoes. We know that those volcanoes are going to erupt. And therefore, we're now in a much more resilient position to actually manage the risk associated with it. One of the most incredible things that has come out of the Eyjafjallajokull eruption was a sort of like a monitoring system called FutureVolc. And FutureVolc is an Icelandic-run company, which basically looks at making sure that when the next volcano erupts, we are in a good position in terms of planning, monitoring, prediction, and protection. So it's basically there to minimize the risk. They have got the most amazing communication system with the volcanic action areas all around the world. They've got seismometers, they've got levees, they're monitoring the gas, they're monitoring the water, they've got GPS systems everywhere. They've set up a fantastic text system, so anybody that's in the vicinity receives a text. And the models that they have used have all come from the Eyjafjallajokull volcano and eruption. So it's really quite important. Here's some of the pictures of the kind of things that they are doing. You know, you can see some of the equipment that they've got here. And all of this means that we have more accurate monitoring, which can lead to better planning and predictions for the future. So we are minimizing the risk. We're not minimizing the hazard, but we're minimizing the risk. And that is what is so important. Iceland has really considerably improved the information that it provides, not just its population, but also any visitors. And on the website, we've got lots of detailed information as to what might happen should there be a volcanic eruption. It's in both the diagrammatic and the written form. It's got lots of information. And then it's also got lots of information about specific volcanoes as well. This is a collaboration between the Icelandic Meteorological Office, the University of Iceland, and the government emergency team. And it gives clear and detailed information on each volcano and where there's an increased risk, and where there's a heightened awareness. It gives very clear guidance and sort of like emergency evacuation plans. There's also this very effective texting system and an emergency app, which, you know, as a guide, we all have the emergency app on our phone, and that keeps us, it's like a Bluetooth, it knows where we are, it can track and trace us. And if we are in the vicinity of where there is a heightened awareness or somewhere that we need to know where there's an increased risk, then we will be alerted to that. This actually was really invaluable just last year, and actually just in the last week. There's been some quite sort of significant activity in the Reken's Peninsula at the moment, and people that are living within the vicinity have all been alerted via text and via the app, with quite clear instructions as to what's happening, what precautions they needed to take, and it was incredibly effective and is working very well. I just wanted to share with you a very personal view from a resident of Vik. He's a personal friend of mine and Discover the World's actually. He lives in Vik, which is in the shadow of the KATLA volcano. And the KATLA volcano is considered to be overdue. The last time it erupted was 1918. It caused a significant flooding event in the town of Vik. And as Julius says, you know, KATLA volcano is considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes in Iceland, potentially even the world. And it's very close to the beautiful town of Vik. So therefore, every single home in Vik has an evacuation guide, and they regularly have evacuation drills. And it's all because historically, a KATLA eruption can seriously influence the people of Vik in a matter of 30 minutes, and they need to be prepared. And you'll see here from the image that there's a little church here on some quite high land above the town of Vik, and this is where everybody who lives on this coastal plain has to evacuate to. So it's got a very, very large car park for the size of the church. Actually, the church can probably only hold about 50 people, but I think the car park can probably hold around about 100 cars. So, you know, this would be the area that the residents of Vik would actually go to. And this sign that Julius is holding, this is basically a checklist, you know, what you need to do. And then you put this on your window to say that you have evacuated your house and how many people you have taken with you. So therefore the rescue services would know that that house is empty and that you've got, you know, however, your family with you. If you want to know more about this, there's a little video here which is quite interesting, and you can take a look at that. Okay, so why do people live in Iceland? Magnus Magnusson, he used to present Mastermind, actually. He says, when you live in a country which moves alarmingly under your feet every 5 years or so with an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, you face, like the saga heroes of old, a choice of two courses of action. Neither of them are pretty good, actually. Either to flee out of the country and all its hazards, or to stay and brave them out. And for more than 1100 years, the people of Iceland have chosen to stay and brave them out. And like we say, you know, they don't just live in Iceland, they really do thrive. So they've got plenty of geothermal energy, okay? All of their energy either comes from hydroelectric power or it comes from geothermal power. This particular plant here that I've got an image of, this is the Heklusheidi geothermal power plant. It's the largest power plant in Iceland, and it is the 6th largest power plant in the world. And here they have got geothermal energy. Very, very simple concept. You get the water, you pump it down, it heats, the steam turns a turbine. Very, very simple process. But the skills and the technologies incorporated by the engineers in Iceland are now being shared all around the world. It's considered to be quite sort of like innovative, and so they're sharing this technology. It's globalization at its very best, isn't it? You know, because they're particularly looking at some of the LICs, particularly Indonesia actually, to see if they can harness their geothermal energy as well. It's very effective, it's very sustainable. Icelandic people's electricity, heating and hot water bills are on average £17 a month. That's 17 £17 a month. And in the UK, I don't know if you know, but it's over £200 a month on average. It also enabled other industries to develop and thrive, like aluminium processing. This is a large aluminium plant on the Reykjanes Peninsula where they produce foil. So, you know, the power is very, very cheap, which means that they can have these high energy factories. And then farming is now a central part of the Icelandic economy. It keeps them independent, it keeps them sustainable. But it's not fertile soils that's actually allowing farming in Iceland to thrive. It's actually the geothermal energy. The soils here are actually rather thin. The country's quite new geologically, but the development of geothermal energy has led to significant growth in greenhouse areas. And they're now able to grow tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, strawberries and mushrooms all year round. Some years, actually, Iceland, which is really weird, bearing in mind it has a very short growing season. You know, it really is quite dark in the winter. But, you know, some years Iceland is not only able to meet the full domestic demand, so in other words, enough tomatoes, cucumbers, strawberries for their domestic population, they're actually having enough to export out to other Nordic countries, which, you know, is something to really get your head around, that a place on the Arctic Circle near enough can produce enough fruit and vegetables to export to other countries. So maybe we'll be seeing Icelandic grown tomatoes in our supermarkets in not too long a time. Okay, so then also another reason to live in Iceland, the tourism. It's an integral and very important part of the Icelandic economy. And in 2019, 40% of the economy and workforce was linked to tourism. I think they are going to have to reconsider their reliance on tourism a little bit, because obviously the last year has meant that it's had a significant impact on the economy, and they're certainly developing their fishing and their aluminium plants a little bit more again, because they were quite dependent on tourism. So that's something that they will need to consider. So I just want to look at some extra things that can enrich and develop your understanding of these just a little bit more. I mean, tonight is just a snapshot of this particular sort of case study and the topic, and we've got some other things that can possibly help you. There's a case study video completely free for you to look at. It's on our website, the link is here, but if you type in Eyjafjallajokull case study, it will come up on YouTube, or it will come up on our website, and you can view it through the both. There's also some additional teaching resources on our website as well. So if you're a teacher and you're watching this, then please do go on to there, because you'll find they're all free. You can just download them and adapt them to your classroom and to your students. But if you're a student watching this and you're looking at it as a revision exercise, there's some really good sort of, you know, topical things that you can look at on there. And then we also have another couple of YouTube videos that we did earlier this academic year, actually. So, you know, looking specifically at Iceland in terms of living with natural hazards in a little bit more detail. You can look at that via our website or through YouTube there. And then if you want more detailed information on the reflections of the Eyjafjallajokull eruption and the impacts, then you can take a look at that one as well. And then we do have some other webinars that you can look at. We've done lots of different ones over the last few months. And rather like this one, they're all free. You can share them with your students. You can use them. You can dip in and out of them, show bits of them. Please do use them. They're there to help you and to support you. We do have another webinar next Monday, which is quite specific. It's linked to energy and the challenge of resource management. So looking at that and looking at Costa Rica, Norway and Iceland in terms of how they are looking at their resources and how they are using them to produce the energy that they need. So please do join us for that. You just need to sign up again for the link, but then Kat will send it through to you. So thank you so much for joining me this evening. I know some of you want to share the link with your students and your colleagues over the next few weeks. That's absolutely fine. Please do that. Do use our resources as much as you possibly can. Take care of yourselves. Enjoy going back to school next week. I really feel, if you're a teacher, I really feel for you next week. And just take one day at a time, but really enjoy having those kids back in the classroom, and students really enjoy being back in the classroom. And take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you.